Hi guys, last week during a live stream over on our Facebook page, we covered how to edit Northern Lights photos in Adobe Lightroom. We figured you guys might like to see that too, so we're going to go ahead and share it here. Let's take a look. Okay, let's get into Lightroom. So first thing is, I want to talk about what version of Lightroom I'm going to be using today. And there's a few things about this. This is going to be Lightroom Classic, which is what I typically use. There are, of course, multiple versions. There's Creative Cloud, there's the mobile version. A lot of these things are going to translate to the other versions, but for today, we'll be working in Lightroom Classic. I've gone ahead and pre-selected several images here from over the years. I've got a couple of Canon files, a couple of Nikon files, and several Sony files, so that we can get an array of different files to work with. All of these photos that you see here were shot over the last decade or so. I think the first one started in 2013 on my Canon 5D Mark II, and then it progresses up into the A7 III, which is what I currently shoot for Aurora photos. These are the raw files. They have not been edited. I have not touched these files in a very long time, so it's going to be interesting. I'm going to be having to relearn how to work because the last time I edited some of these was several versions back in Lightroom, and we have some new tools. So we'll kind of do that together. We'll go through these and I'll show you how I'm going to process them. Before I get started with the processing, a couple of things. This is my way of processing. It doesn't necessarily mean it's right. It's just one way that you can do things. This also goes under the premise that you already know some things about Lightroom, that you know how to get your photos into Lightroom, you know how to get into the develop module, and you know how to work with files there. So I'm not going to be covering the how to use Lightroom. I'm going to be covering how to use Lightroom specifically for Aurora photos. So if you guys want to cover later at another time the basics of Lightroom, like an intro to Lightroom topic, we could probably do that, or we could build a workshop downloadable video for that, because that would be a little bit more in depth than we probably have time to cover in a live stream. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's start off with this very first file. This is a file, as I mentioned, from the Canon 5D Mark II. This was shot St. Paddy's Day 2013, one of the best Aurora displays we've ever had. And you may notice, or you may have seen this photo recently, it was on the cover of Alaska Magazine for their January issue. In this particular case, we're already starting off with a pretty decent file. Things are looking pretty good, but there's a lot that can be added to it. When we bring in a raw file, we want to make sure that we give it a little pop. It's always going to need a little bit of contrast. The way I typically work with my Photoshop or my Lightroom files when I'm developing them is I start in the develop panel. I start with the basic tab, and I start at the top and work my way down through all the different settings. There's not a lot, honestly, that I end up doing typically with a raw file if it's an Aurora shot, if it was exposed properly. So this one was exposed pretty well. Looks like our shutter speed was 10 seconds. We were at f2.8 1600 ISO, and this was with the 16 to 35 at 20 millimeters. So this was the original 16 to 35. This was before I had picked up the second version. So one of the things you'll notice as we dig into this image is we're going to have a little bit of coma in the edges. You could pick that out and do some spot removal. I personally leave things alone. I try not to Photoshop a lot of stuff out, but that's a personal choice. But in the center, you see it's pretty clean, looks good. ISO 1600 noise isn't too bad on this file, but we'll clean that up a little bit and then we'll add some sharpening at the end. But let's go ahead and dig into it. So first thing I want to do is check my white balance. Now, in this particular example, I'm pretty happy with where my white balance is. Everything looks good. It looks like I got it right in the camera, which I do try to do whether I'm shooting RAW or JPEG. So we're going to leave the white balance alone. The reds are saturating really nice, which is a nice feature of Canons. Reds tend to show up a little bit better in the Canons than they do the Nikons or the Sonys. But the greens are a little lackluster, and we're lacking a little bit of definition. And it's a little on the dark side. So we're going to go ahead and start with the exposure. And so we're going to bring that up just a touch, just enough that we can start to really see that light popping through there. Maybe right about there. Next thing we need to do, of course, is add some contrast. Like I said, typically with any raw file, you're going to need to add a little contrast. Now, if I wanted to make a crop to this image, in this case I don't, but I would have probably started there with the crop tool. This one's looking pretty good. Horizon's pretty straight. I'm liking the tree line. I like everything about the composition. I might tilt it just ever so slightly. But not really a lot to do with this file there. Then we'll get into the contrast. We're going to bring up that contrast until we're really starting to see a little bit more of that sky coming back through the Aurora. Somewhere about there. I'm liking that. And then I go play with the highlights. In this case, the greens are looking a little high, so I'm going to bring that down just ever so slightly. If I were playing with a Nikon or a Sony file, at this point I would probably bring up just a little bit of details in the shadow. I'll be honest, the old Canon 5D Mark II was not well known. I'll show you kind of what happens. It doesn't give us a lot of detail there in those shadows. And as we do, if I bring this in, you'll see that it really starts to break down in the shadows. We're starting to get a little noise popping through. So in this case, the contrast is fine. I'm going to bring those up just a touch, but I think it looks good like that. It was kind of meant to be a silhouette shot, so we're looking good. Not much to do with the whites or the blacks in this case. Some other images later, we'll get into that. In this case, I'm pretty happy with this. One of the features I do like that's pretty new with Lightroom is the texture slider. I actually use it as kind of a pre-noise reduction. So now that we've brought in the exposure up a tad, you can see the noise is a little bit more apparent. Not too bad in the highlights, but here in these darker spots, we're starting to see a little bit of the noise. So I'll take that texture slider and drop it down just a touch, just to kind of take some of that initial noise out. I don't want to go so far, because if I go too far, I will start to lose all the detail in my stars and my trees, and everything just gets kind of soft, and I don't want that to happen, but I do want to take a little bit of that noise down, so maybe somewhere right around there. Clarity is subjective. Some folks use it. I used to. I don't tend to touch clarity much. I'll show you what it does. Is it kind of gives like a mid-tone contrast. I personally don't like the look of the clarity slider, and so I don't typically use it these days. So I'll kind of leave that one alone. Dehaze, depending on the shot that you're doing, sometimes has some value, sometimes it doesn't. I tend to not use it for Aurora photos. I really like it for underwater, but it will add a little bit of contrast back into those midtones in a better way than the clarity slider. In fact, if I were going to use one of the two, it would probably be dehaze. But you can really easily overdo it very quickly, and so you have to be kind of subtle with that slider. I'm going to go ahead and leave it where it was. And just if you don't know, if you get a slider kind of out of whack and you're like, man, I'm having a hard time getting this back, if you double click on it, it will reset back to the neutral setting. So in this case, 0. Next slider we're going to play with is vibrance. Saturation I don't usually use. I don't like that, honestly, for almost any situation. Maybe if I'm shooting a landscape and I've got some green foliage and things like that I want to bring up just a touch, I might add a little bit of saturation, but a little bit goes a long ways, and it's really easy to overdo it. I'll kind of show you. And sometimes when you're seeing those super colorful Aurora photos, what you're seeing is somebody's grabbed that saturation slider and just kind of cranked it. I prefer to use vibrance, and I don't even like a whole lot of vibrance. But the vibrance, as you notice, it gets crazy, but it is a little more subtle, and it tends to leave kind of the red and orange tones alone. So we'll bring up just a little bit of vibrance there. After doing all those adjustments, I'm still feeling like this needs a touch more contrast, so we're going to add a little bit more contrast here, maybe right about there. Okay, I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. Next thing we need to do is clean up the rest of this noise. And so I have kind of a process that I like to use for that. So we're going to go into the details panel next. There you're going to find sharpening and noise reduction both. Now, one key thing to note about this, I do like to zoom the image all the way in. And if you wanted to, you could have your little preview here, which will show you a zoomed in version. I tend to just zoom the image in at 1:1 so that I can see it a little bit better. I've got a nice large monitor here, so that makes life a little bit easier. But where we really want to focus is where our noise is most apparent. So right in here, seeing quite a bit of noise. And so we're going to go into the noise reduction tool first. One of the things I like to do is make sure that I'm holding the Alt or Option key as I'm adjusting any of these sliders in the details panel. If you're on Windows, that's going to be the Alt key. If you're on Mac, it's going to be the Option key. Here's what's going to happen. As I grab this luminance slider, I press and hold the Alt key, and then I click and drag that, and you can see it basically brings it down to the chroma key, or the black and white channel, sorry, which is going to allow me to see really where I'm affecting that image. And on the noise reduction, I'll add a fair amount of it to get rid of noise. This one's not terribly bad, so we're going to go right about there. We're starting to get rid of the noise, but as you can see, we're also starting to lose a little bit of detail, and that's okay. We're going to bring that back in the next step. We're going to sharpen it back up. So what we're going to do is, again, hold the Alt key down, and I'm going to grab my mask here. And when I drag this masking slider over, you can see as I'm holding the Alt key, it'll show you exactly what elements of the image are going to be sharpened. I don't really want the Aurora itself to be sharpened because we'll end up with some banding and some funny artifacts. What I really care about is, just like you're seeing there, the edges of those trees and those stars are what need to be sharp. So right about there looks good for masking. Then I'm going to check the radius, again holding that Alt key, and here I can see that I am going to end up sharpening some of that noise. So you can see those little blotches in between the stars. So if I bring that radius slider down a bit, you can see that that mask starts to not affect that. Now we're really only into the trees and the stars. Now as I bring my sharpening slider up, I'm sharpening those elements only, and I'm not bringing too much of that noise back. And so that looks pretty good to me. I think I'm happy with where that one's at. So that's an old Canon file. Next we'll move into a Canon 5D Mark III. This was, let me look, I think this was February 28th. Yeah, February 28th, 2014. Really spectacular night. We had a lot of reds. We were sitting up at Skiland waiting to see a rocket go off, hoping that the rocket would launch. And so I had a time lapse going and another camera going on time lapse. I had two different setups, and then I was shooting stills with the 5D Mark III. Ended up with a lot of reds that night. It ended up being just a spectacular night. I don't believe the rocket went off, if I recall right, but we still had amazing photos to be had. So we made the most of it. You can see the ski slope down in here. Now, in this case, there are some adjustments that I'm going to need to make. One of the things that drives me crazy is I see that we have a crooked horizon. So we're going to go back up into our basic panel here. We're going to grab the crop tool, and we're going to just straighten that out a little bit. Now, as I straighten that out, I'm kind of noticing the Aurora ends up looking a little crooked. The dominant line in this case is my horizon, so that's the predominant thing I'm worried about. And as you can see, I've got the, you have different overlays. If you tab through your O key while you're in the crop tool, you'll get different overlays. This one is the rule of thirds, which a lot of people like to use. I prefer the golden ratio, which is this one. For nature photos, because when we look at nature, the golden ratio is everywhere. And so when I'm cropping my images, I tend to kind of use that. And you'll notice I pretty much kind of shoot that way anyway. I've trained myself over the years to see my images that way. But we might just bring this down just a touch so it's right there, get a little bit more of that sky, and we'll call that good on the crop. Now in this case, this one's going to be a little bit tricky because we've got some nice bright greens here, a little bit yellowish from the Canon, which was pretty typical when I was shooting them. But we've also got some nice reds, and I want to be able to bring those out without overdoing these greens. So we're going to play around with this one a little bit. First thing I want to do is actually go into my highlights and pull the green down just a touch. Then I can bring my exposure back up just a bit. Not too much, but just enough where I'm starting to see those reds kind of meet up with the greens. We'll bring that highlights down just a touch more. And you can see if I go too far, it starts to look a little funky. So we got to be careful where we go with that. We don't want to manipulate too much. So somewhere around there. In this case, I'm going to try to bring shadows up just a touch because I do want to see a little bit of that foreground. I like that ski slope. and that whole valley down beneath it. So we'll bring that back up, see how our noise is looking. Not too bad, so I think that's acceptable. You will see we're starting to get a little bit of noise in the sky, but again, we'll go in and clean that up. Okay, and then to add back a little contrast, we're going to start first with the contrast slider. And we've got to be careful because this one is so exposed on those greens that we can really overdo it quick. Somewhere right around there. I don't want to lose the detail in these highlights, so I got to be careful about that. But you can see my reds are starting to come back out a little bit. In this case, again, we're going to go into that texture slider, bring that down just a touch, maybe around there to kind of clean up that noise kind of preemptively. And then we'll bring that vibrance up a touch, see if we can get a little bit more of those reds out of this without affecting the greens too much. Somewhere around there. Like I said, a little bit goes a long ways. It doesn't take a whole lot. If I wanted to further refine the reds, I could go into the hue, saturation, and luminance channels. I could play with the luminance in the red channel. As you can see, not doing a lot here. Maybe we'll try it in the orange channel. That's really where most of it is. I don't want to really play with the luminance, but if we wanted to add a little bit of the saturation into the reds, we could. In this case, I might give it a touch. Again, I don't want to manipulate too much here. And the oranges, yeah, we're just going to leave that one alone. Then we're going to go into our detail slider. I was noticing the most noise was kind of right down in this section. So we want to, again, hold the Option key or Alt key. And we're going to bring that noise reduction. This one's going to take a little bit more than the last image did. Starting to look pretty good there. And we're not losing too much detail. Got a nice sharp image to begin with. Grab my masking slider. Take it down to where I'm really just seeing stars. And then the radius slider, bring that down to where we're not seeing any of the noise in that mask. And then we'll bring our sharpening back up. And that looks pretty good. Pretty happy with that one. In this case, I may actually add just a touch more magenta and cool that down just a touch more. Something about like that. I like that file. Okay, let's move on to a Nikon file, and this one's a little tricky. This one was shot September 2015 at a little lake, and I was shooting with a 12mm fisheye. I believe it was the Rokinon fisheye 12mm. So the very first thing I'm going to want to do with this file is do some lens correction, because I do not like this lens distortion. Sometimes that's okay, but luckily Lightroom has some lens correction features built right in. So we're going to go down to the lens corrections panel, enable profile correction. And as you can see, Lightroom has pre-built in, it recognizes which lens I was shooting in this case, because I was shooting it on the Nikon. It recognizes all of that and pre-builds that profile in for me and fixes it out. Okay, next thing we're going to do is go into our cropping tool, and we're going to straighten that horizon out just a touch. Something like that. That's a little too much. Maybe back just a touch, something like that. So you can see we've still got a little bit of that distortion. I'm okay with that. I just didn't like the full-on barrel distortion. It was a little too much. This is more what I would intend to shoot with that 12mm. Of course, because it's so wide, if you don't get that horizon perfectly straight, it does get that distortion to it. So if I wanted to not edit the photo, I could shoot this with horizon straight in the middle. I don't tend to do that unless I've got a really nice reflection. If I had a nice big lake, this one was pretty small in this case, but if I had a nice big lake that was nice and calm, I could have put the horizon right in the middle, and that might be an exception. Again, going back to those compositional rules though, it tends to be kind of boring to put your horizon right in the middle, and so I generally don't shoot that way unless there's a reason to do so. All right, so this one, we're starting off a little on the dark side. So we're going to go ahead and bring our exposure up just a tad, bring our contrast up, and our highlights down just a bit. Bring the exposure up a touch more, Okay, now we can see a little bit more of that sky. We're still not blowing out the highlights yet. I do want a little shadow detail in this, and because I was shooting the D750, I can get that out of it. So I don't want to go crazy. As you can see, if I do go crazy, this is what I love about the Nikons and the Sonys, is you have all the shadow information. But and you can see we had nice fall colors there, but that's overdoing it to me. So we're just going to bring back enough that we can kind of see a little bit of that foreground detail. And then as I'm seeing that, I can see the edge of that lake that I didn't see, so we're going to straighten that up a bit more. Something like that. Back just a touch. There we go. Okay, and again, we're going to go look for noise. We were shooting at 3200 ISO, as you can see on this one. And as you see, another advantage that I liked about shooting the Nikons and the Sonys, at least back in the day, is that the noise performance was a little bit better on those sensors. Canon has gotten a lot better at that with the EOS R and the 5D Mark IV. But back when I was shooting the 5D Mark II and the Mark III, they did not handle the noise quite as well. So now I can get away with a little higher ISO, but there is still some noise to clean up. So we're going to bring that texture slider down just a bit, and you can see that really already starts to clean up quite a bit of that. Then we're going to go into our vibrance, see how that looks. And way too much, maybe right about there, looks pretty good. Again, it doesn't take a whole lot, and as you can see, when we're starting off with these files, they're already about halfway there. Then we're going to go again into our detail panel. We're going to zoom in, kind of look at our noisy areas, maybe right in this part of the sky we can see quite a bit. We're going to hold the Alt key and drag that noise reduction up somewhere around there. Grab our masking slider, take that down to just the trees and the stars. Radius slider down to just the stars, and sharpen it all back up. Like that. Looks pretty good. Okay, let's go into another D750 file. Same thing, we got a little more color in this one. This was at a nice big lake. You'll notice I did get my horizon a little bit closer to the center, but again, still not perfect. So we're going to go down into our lens correction tools again, enable profile correction. We're going to straighten out that horizon. And for me, that cut out a little bit too much, and I'm okay to have a little bit more of that distortion if I can have a little bit more of my image. So we're going to play with that distortion, bring it back just a touch so we get a little bit more of that image back. Something like that. And then we'll recrop it, kind of straighten it back out a bit. Something like that. And then we'll go in and play with the basic adjustments. So in this case, I'm fairly happy with where this is. Definitely needs some contrast. I would like to bring those highlights down a touch so we're not blowing them out. Maybe bring the overall exposure up just a touch. Everything else looks fairly good to me. Let's see how shadows look. We could get a lot out of that with the shadows. I'm not particularly interested in doing so. Maybe just a touch there. Again, let's check our noise. Not too noisy on this one, but we'll bring that texture down just a touch. And I would like to see a little bit more of the purple, so let's see what happens when we bring our vibrance up just a touch. Something like that. Again, a little bit goes a long way. You can really overdo it, so be careful with those vibrance and saturation sliders. But now we're really seeing some of those purples pretty well. If we go back to the before and after, you can kind of see what we started with and where we've ended up. And most of that's done in just the contrast, the highlights, and that kind of stuff. Next thing we're going to do, let's turn that back off, is go into our details panel again, clean up some of that noise. We're going to go into the noise reduction, bring that slider up. That looks pretty good. Mask it back off once again. Somewhere around there. Play with our radius till we get rid of the noise out of the sharpening. And then we'll sharpen it back up. Something like that. That looks pretty good. Okay, let's dive into some Sony files. So I've got a couple of different cameras here. I've got a file from the A7R2, which was the one of the first full-frame Sonys I started shooting my Aurora stills with. I've got 2 files from there actually, and one is a little on the underexposed side, one is a little underexposed with the highlights. So you can see we're almost about to blow out. Those purples get so bright that it's difficult to expose the rest of the image if you don't want to lose the detail or the color in those. And so we're going to play with some shadow work in this one and try to bring some of that shadow detail back out. And then the next one I've got is a A7R3, which is a little underexposed on a nearly full moonlit night. So we'll play with that and talk about how to deal with that. And then one of the last images I shot from the current season, which is with the A7III of the Corona. But let's go back into our first Sony file. So A7R2 file, lots of really nice colors. This was August 30th, 2017. Really spectacular night. We had Aurora like this for probably 2 or 3 hours. And so we had lots of great opportunities to shoot beautiful colors with these reflections on the lake. We had some of our clients posing out on the dock under the Aurora. It was just a spectacular night. It was our first night back, and it was a really nice way to start the season. I really like this particular file. I was shooting this with, I believe, 12 to 24 millimeter f4. You'll notice that I'm shooting at 6400. To make up for that f4, I had to shoot at 6400. But you'll notice this file on the Sony is fairly clean. There is some noise there, but it's not terrible. But let's make this image pop a little bit. So compositionally, I'm fairly happy with this. I think we've got a fairly straight horizon. Everything's kind of where I would want it. I don't want to crop this down for the golden ratio because I don't want to lose any of that sky, so we're going to leave it just as is. We do want to bring the exposure up just a touch though, because I want those purples and those blues to start to pop a little bit. And then you can see we're starting to blow out the greens. So we're going to pull the highlights back down a little bit, somewhere about there. Maybe bring shadows up because on this particular file, we've got enough dynamic range we can do that. And then when I bring shadows up, I'll add a little contrast back by just affecting the blacks. So I want to add that crunch back into it, but I still want to see a little bit of shadow detail in the dock and things like that. So something like that. Again, we're going to go into the texture slider, kind of peel back some of that noise initially. Not too much, somewhere around there. And we might add a little vibrance. I don't know that this one's going to need much. Yeah, a little bit really goes a long way. Maybe just a touch, something like that. But those blues were already so nicely saturated that I don't think we need a lot there. And we're going to go into the details slider once again. Same process as before. Noise reduction up. A little bit more. There we go, something about like that. We're going to mask that back off till we're just seeing our stars. This one's going to take a good bit of masking somewhere around there. I want to see how our dock's looking with that masking because I would like to see a little bit of that. That's perfect. Just outlined. Go back up to where my noise was. We're going to grab our radius slider, bring that down a touch, and bring our sharpening back up. This one we're going to be careful with because as we bring the sharpening back up, we're starting to see some of that noise pop back in. So it's right about there. We're going to kind of split the difference there. Overall, really nice image. I'm pretty happy with how that looks. Okay, next file. Again, this is from the Sony A7R2 as well. Another spectacular night. Let's see what date this was shot. This was September 27th, 2017. Early in the evening. It was a super early display. And what I was exposing for again was these purples. I didn't want to blow those out, but that left me with a lot of dark detail here. So we're going to see if we can bring some of that back without kind of just wrecking the overall image. Again, cropping, pretty happy. I think everything looks pretty decent there, so we're going to pretty much leave that alone. I don't want to play with exposure. I like the way the purples are, and you'll see if I start to slide that up at all, we really start to lose the detail in those purples. So maybe just a tiny smidgen. We are going to pull our highlights, and as we pull our highlights, then we could bring the exposure up just a touch and still not lose those purples. And that's helping with the overall exposure. Now we're going to bring the shadows up because I do want a little more detail. I've got to be careful because it starts to look kind of moonlit-y if I go too far, but somewhere like there, then I can start to see a little bit of that foreground across the lake and a little bit more detail in the trees and the Aurora itself. Bring a little bit more contrast back into that just to kind of help compensate. That looks pretty good. Noise isn't too bad, but there is some. Let's see what ISO. We were at 6400 again with that 12 mil. We'll bring that texture slider back down again. Just kind of preemptively like that. And this one, I'm not even going to touch vibrance. I'm really happy with how the camera captured both the purples and the green colors in this case. And so we're just going to leave that as it was. Now we'll go into our detail slider. And once again, holding that Alt key, we're going to bring the luminance noise reduction up. Maybe a touch more. Yeah, that noise goes away pretty well in this image. Let me get into the darker area because we're in the highlights, so we're not going to see it quite as well. There we go. And then we're going to go into our masking tool, once again holding that Alt or Option key. Get rid of all of that noise out of the mask. Radius tool, get rid of the noise out of the mask. And then sharpener back up so we bring our detail back. There we go, something like that. Turns that into a really nice image. Let's check out our before and afters here. So, didn't change the image overall. Cleaned up the noise, brought a little bit of the greens back in, and we got just a little more shadow detail out of it. Pretty happy with the way that one's looking. Okay, let's go into the A7R3 file. Now again, in this case, this one's an underexposed image. I do want to bring up the exposure in this case because I was trying to make sure I wasn't blowing anything out, and I think I overcompensated, or possibly I had my screen brightness up too bright and thought that I was shooting these brighter than I was, which does happen on occasion. So we're gonna bring the exposure up quite a bit in this case. I'm gonna come up to about 1.5 stops over. Now I'm starting to like this. We're still not blowing anything out. We're seeing our foreground, and that's how I would have liked to have shot it in the first place. But since I didn't, luckily we can kind of bring things back a little bit. Straighten that out just a touch. I'm really liking the composition here, the way the trees are split. Everything about this image speaks to me personally. So we're going to go about like that. Now I am going to want to add a little bit more contrast back in. In this case, I'm not going to go too heavy with the contrast because what happens is we start to blow those highlights out when we do that. So instead, I'm going to bring it up just a touch, and then we're going to play with blacks to bring some of the contrast back into these trees, because that's only going to affect the darkest regions and not crunch up my highlights here. So we'll bring the blacks back down a touch, something like that. I'm going to bring shadow detail up. Actually, I'm not. I don't like the way that's affecting my blacks. Maybe we'll bring highlights up. No, we're going to leave that alone too. Something like that. Kick the exposure back up just a touch. Bring those blacks down a little more. There we go. Actually, bring those up a touch. Something like that. So what I've done now, as you can see, I'm just going to go to the before and after here. We've brought in all that detail back in that we missed. Our Aurora is where it should have been had we shot that appropriately, and we've got still some nice contrast in those blacks. Again, if you do that with the contrast slider, in this case, you're going to really blow out those highlights. Now let's check our noise. Again, this one was at 6400. This was with the 16 to 35. We got quite a bit of noise in here. So this one's because we brought that exposure up so much. In post-production. Again, one of the reasons that ideally I should have shot it that way to begin with, because now as I bring it up, I'm starting to get more noise. But we can clean it up. So we'll bring our noise reduction up. And I got to be careful because I'm starting to lose the detail in those trees. So we're going to split the difference here. There we go. And we're going to go back into our masking, mask everything but the stars and the trees out of that. Bring our radius back down and our sharpening back up. There we go. All right, managed to make a decent image out of that. Okay, and then finally, let's go ahead and get into a Corona shot from the Sony A7 III. This one was taken last March 17th. Our last tour of the season ended up being March 18th. So this was the second to last night we were out. Beautiful night. It was a really nice kind of close to the season. And so I'm happy to have had this image. And I'll be honest, I don't typically shoot straight up at the Coronas. I like to have some trees in the foreground, but in this case we were out on the middle of a frozen lake and there wasn't any trees around, and I didn't want to miss the Corona shot, so we shot it that way anyway. In this case, little dark, so we're going to bring the exposure up a little bit. Now as we do that, we're starting to wash out where these fainter auroras are. And that's okay if you like that. In this case, I do want some more contrast. So I'm going to bring the contrast up a bit heavy on this one so that we can make it pop, pull the highlights back down just a touch. I'm going to bring my blacks down just a little bit. And then I am going to bring the vibrance up just a touch on this one because I do want to see those purples come in to the shot there. Something like that. Again, not dramatically, but we do want to bring a little bit of that color back in. This one, let's see where we were. ISO-wise, 3200 on the A7 III is going to be fine. We're going to hardly see any noise. But let's go ahead and bring that texture slider down just a touch. Go into our details panel once again. And again, hold Alt or Option key. And we're going to bring that up a bit. Not needing quite as much this time, luckily. And we're going to drag that down till we're just starting to see mostly stars. And same thing with our radius. And bring our sharpening back up. And there you go, guys. That's pretty much how we deal with most of our Aurora photos. All right, guys, if you enjoyed that, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe down below. We look forward to producing more of this content, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Leave us some comments. Tell us if you found this helpful or what you would like to see us cover in the future. All right, guys. See you later.